The question that echoed. The evening sun cast long shadows across the polished floor of the Shreveport Church Fellowship Hall. Normally reserved for Sunday potlucks and lively Bible studies, tonight the space held a different kind of energy. Folding chairs scraped against the floor as people settled into their seats, murmurs rippling through the room like waves. It wasn't every day that a former president came to town, and the modest hall buzzed with curiosity and anticipation. Donald Trump stood at the front of the room, his larger-than-life presence slightly subdued under the low ceiling and dim light. He adjusted his tie, his usual confident gestures tinged with restraint. His signature appearance, the tan complexion, bright red tie, and unmistakable wave of hair, was familiar to everyone present. But tonight, there was an air of gravity in his demeanor. The audience, a mix of retirees, families, and curious locals, watched him intently. Some came to hear his thoughts on policy. Others were simply intrigued by the man who had been at the center of countless headlines. In the back of the room, an 8-year-old girl named Lily sat quietly, clutching an old leather-bound Bible to her chest. The Bible, worn from decades of use, had once belonged to her late grandmother, its gold lettering faded and its pages frayed. For Lily, it was more than a book. It was a connection to the woman who had taught her to pray and ask the big questions. Her mother sat beside her, whispering words of encouragement. "You can ask him, but only if you're brave enough, Lily," she said, her voice soft but firm, "and only if it comes from your heart." Lily nodded, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might leap out of her chest. For weeks, she had been rehearsing her question, scribbling it in her notebook during recess and murmuring it to herself before bed. It wasn't a simple question, not one born of childish curiosity. It was a question that had grown heavy in her heart, one she felt compelled to ask. As the event began, Trump launched into his prepared remarks. He spoke about the country's future, his policies, and the challenges ahead. The audience clapped politely, some nodding in agreement, though the atmosphere lacked the electric energy of his campaign rallies. Lily waited, her small hands gripping the edges of her Bible as her nerves grew. Finally, it was time for questions. A microphone stand was placed at the center of the room, and a line quickly formed. Adults eagerly approached to ask about infrastructure, healthcare, and the economy. Lily hesitated, sinking further into her chair. Her palms felt clammy, and her legs trembled as if they might give way. Her mother leaned close. "Now's your chance," she whispered. "You can do this." Gathering every ounce of courage, Lily stood. Her legs wobbled as she made her way to the line, the oversized Bible pressed tightly against her chest. The crowd began to notice her, a small girl among the sea of adults. Murmurs spread as people pointed her out, their curiosity piqued. When it was finally her turn, Trump looked down at her, his expression softening. He leaned slightly forward, his usual commanding presence replaced by something gentler. "And what's your question, young lady?" he asked, his voice warm and inviting. Lily swallowed hard. The room felt impossibly large, and every pair of eyes seemed to be on her. She gripped her Bible tighter, its familiar texture grounding her. Taking a deep breath, she spoke, her voice trembling but steady. "Mr. Trump," she began, her words clear despite the lump in her throat, "what does God mean to you?" The room fell silent. The chatter ceased, and even the sound of shuffling feet seemed to vanish. All eyes shifted to Trump, the weight of Lily's question hanging heavily in the air. Trump froze for a moment, uncharacteristically, at a loss for words. He glanced at the little girl, then at the Bible in her hands. The vulnerability in her voice and the sincerity of her question seemed to pierce through the layers of bravado he typically wore. He stepped back from the podium slightly, one hand resting on its edge as he took a deep breath. The crowd watched, captivated, as the man known for his quick comebacks and sharp retorts hesitated. The silence stretched, each passing second amplifying the gravity of the moment. "That's a big question," Trump finally said, his voice softer than usual. and it's not one I've always had the answer to." His words surprised the audience. The man who had built a career on certainty and bold declarations was admitting doubt, a rare glimpse of vulnerability. He turned his gaze back to Lily, his expression thoughtful. "When I was about your age," he continued, "I had a lot of questions about God, too. My parents took me to church every Sunday. I remember sitting in those wooden pews, staring at the stained glass windows, wondering if God was really listening." The crowd remained silent, hanging on his every word. Lily's wide eyes never left his face, her small fingers still gripping the edges of her Bible. Trump paused, his gaze drifting momentarily, as if searching for the right words. "I didn't always understand faith," he admitted, "and there were times in my life when I doubted it. Times when I felt lost." He glanced back at Lily, his expression softening further. "But you know what I've learned, Lily. Faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about trusting, even when you don't understand. It's about believing in something bigger than yourself." The sincerity in his voice struck a chord with the audience. For a man often criticized for his ego and self-assuredness, his words carried an unexpected humility. The room felt different now, quieter, more intimate. As Trump continued, he shared a deeply personal story, one he rarely spoke of publicly. He talked about a moment in his life when he faced immense challenges and how, in his darkest hour, he found himself praying, not out of habit, but out of desperation. It was in that moment, he said, that he felt a spark of hope, a reminder that he wasn't alone. By the time he finished, the room was silent, many in the audience visibly moved. Lily's question had shifted the tone of the evening, turning a political event into something profoundly human. As the applause began to swell, Trump looked at Lily again. "Thank you for asking that," he said. "You reminded me, and all of us, what really matters." Lily nodded, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and relief. Her simple question had done something extraordinary. It had created a moment of genuine connection, one that would linger in the hearts of everyone present. The weight of an answer. The night air outside the fellowship hall carried the scent of fresh pine and distant rain, a reminder of Shreveport's southern charm. Inside, however, the atmosphere was far from calm. Lily's question had turned the town hall into something more profound, a collective reckoning with faith, humanity, and vulnerability. As Donald Trump stepped back from the podium, the room held its breath, the weight of the moment still pressing on everyone. Lily sat back down beside her mother, her face flushed with emotion. She clutched her grandmother's Bible even tighter, as if it might anchor her trembling hands. Her mother leaned in, whispering softly, "You did wonderfully, sweetheart. You were brave." Lily didn't respond right away. Her mind was a whirlwind, her heart still pounding from the courage it had taken to stand before so many people. Yet she felt something else, a flicker of hope, that her question had mattered, that it had touched not just the man on the stage, but everyone in the room. Trump, still at the podium, adjusted his tie as if steadying himself. The crowd remained eerily quiet, as though even the slightest sound might shatter the fragile mood. He cleared his throat, his expression more introspective than anyone had seen before. "I want to share something with all of you," he said, his voice carrying a new sincerity. "It's not something I talk about often, but maybe tonight's the right time." The crowd leaned forward in unison, their attention riveted. This wasn't the fiery rhetoric or self-assured proclamations they were used to. This was something different, something real. "There was a time in my life," Trump began, his gaze sweeping the room, "when I felt lost. I was surrounded by success, by wealth, by everything the world says should make you happy. But deep down, I was empty." His words hung in the air, their honesty surprising. He continued, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "It was during those moments, when I felt the most alone, that I started to question everything. I wondered if all of this had gestured broadly, had any meaning at all." Trump paused, his eyes momentarily meeting Lily's. Her small frame, Her unwavering gaze seemed to ground him. One night, when I couldn't sleep, I picked up a Bible someone had given me years earlier. I hadn't opened it in ages, but something compelled me to that night. I didn't know what I was looking for. Answers, maybe. Comfort, or just something to hold on to. The audience was transfixed, the usual rustling and fidgeting absent. Even those who had come with skepticism found themselves drawn into his story. I flipped through the pages, he continued, not knowing where to start. And then I stumbled upon a verse. Proverbs 3-5-6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your paths straight. Trump's voice softened as he recited the words. At first, I didn't understand what it meant. Trust, submit, these weren't words I was used to. But I couldn't stop thinking about them. And slowly, over time, they began to make sense. The room was silent, the audience hanging on every word. Some nodded subtly. Others wiped away tears. Lily watched intently, her young face filled with a mix of awe and understanding. Trump stepped away from the podium and walked a few steps closer to the edge of the stage, his movements deliberate. I'm not standing here tonight pretending I have it all figured out, he said. Faith is a journey. It's not about being perfect or having all the answers. It's about asking the questions, even the hard ones, like the one Lily asked tonight. The mention of her name made Lily's cheeks flush, but she didn't look away. She felt a warmth spread through her chest, a quiet reassurance that her question had truly mattered. Trump continued, his tone shifting slightly, becoming more conversational. I know some of you might look at me and think, what does this guy know about faith? And that's fair. I've made mistakes, plenty of them. I've said things and done things I'm not proud of. But what I've learned, and what I want to share with you, is that faith isn't about being perfect. It's about being willing to admit when you're not. The crowd murmured in agreement, the atmosphere growing even more intimate. Trump glanced around the room, his gaze settling on individuals as if trying to connect with each person present. When I look at Lily, he said, his voice growing softer, I see someone who isn't afraid to ask the big questions, and that reminds me of something we all need to do more often, listen. To each other, to our hearts, and to something greater than ourselves. The applause that followed wasn't the raucous kind he was used to. It was measured, heartfelt, and filled with a sense of shared humanity. Trump smiled faintly, nodding in acknowledgement before returning to the podium. As the event began to wind down, people lingered, reluctant to leave. Conversations bubbled up, not about politics or policy, but about faith, family, and the questions that truly mattered. Many approached Lily and her mother, offering kind words and gentle pats on the shoulder. You've got a special little girl, one elderly woman said, her voice thick with emotion. She reminded us all of something important tonight. Lily's mother smiled, her own eyes glistening. She's always been curious, she replied, her voice filled with pride. But tonight, she was brave. In the corner of the hall, Trump stood surrounded by a few staff members and attendees. Yet his eyes kept drifting toward Lily, as if her simple question had unlocked something deep within him. Eventually, he approached her, his steps measured, his demeanor unusually gentle. Lily, he said, kneeling slightly to meet her at eye level. Thank you for your question. It was one of the best I've ever been asked. Lily looked up at him, her small voice steady. Thank you for answering, Mr. Trump. My grandma always said the best questions are the ones that make people think. He chuckled softly, nodding. Your grandma was a wise woman. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. A man who had stood on the world's biggest stages and a little girl with an old Bible, bridging a gap far greater than age or experience. Keep asking questions, Lily, Trump said, his voice almost a whisper. The world needs more people like you. As he stood and walked back to the stage, Lily felt a sense of peace wash over her. She didn't have all the answers, but tonight, she realized that wasn't the point. Sometimes, the questions were enough. The night ended with the soft hum of goodbyes and the shuffle of chairs being folded away. But the impact of Lily's question and Trump's answer lingered long after the hall was empty. For everyone who had been there, it was a night they would never forget. A ripple of reflection. The following morning, the town of Shreveport awoke to a soft drizzle, the raindrops tapping gently against windows and rooftops. In homes across the community, conversations lingered about the night before. People talked not about politics or policies, but about the profound moment when an 8-year-old girl and a former president connected over a question that many struggle to answer themselves. Lily sat at the kitchen table, the smell of buttered toast and scrambled eggs wafting through the air. Her Bible lay open in front of her, the pages weathered and faintly fragrant with the mustiness of age. Her mother moved about the kitchen, flipping pancakes while sneaking glances at her daughter. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" her mother asked, her voice laced with concern. Lily nodded, though her brow was furrowed. "I think so," she replied, her small fingers tracing the edges of the Bible's pages. "It just feels different." "Different how?" her mother prodded, setting a plate of pancakes in front of her. Lily hesitated, struggling to find the right words, like what happened last night is still happening. Like it's bigger than just me or Mr. Trump. Her mother smiled softly, pulling up a chair beside her. "That's because it is," she said. "Sometimes, when we ask a question that comes from the heart, it doesn't just touch the person we're asking. It reaches everyone who hears it." Lily nodded thoughtfully, taking a small bite of her pancake. As she chewed, her mind wandered back to the fellowship hall. She remembered the way Trump's voice had softened, the way the crowd had quieted, and the way she'd felt, small but somehow significant. Meanwhile, in a hotel suite across town, Donald Trump sat at a desk cluttered with papers and a half-empty cup of coffee. His usual morning routine of brisk phone calls and strategizing felt distant today. Instead, his thoughts kept drifting back to Lily's question. He reached for a notebook and pen, something he rarely did these days. Flipping to a blank page, he began to write. "Faith," he scribbled at the top, underlining the word. "What does it mean to me?" The question lingered, staring back at him like a challenge. For a man accustomed to quick answers and decisive actions, this was uncharted territory. He thought back to the verse he'd shared the night before, Proverbs 3-5-6. It wasn't just a memory, it was a lifeline, one that had pulled him through some of the darkest moments of his life. As he wrote, the room seemed to fade away, his focus entirely on the words forming beneath his pen. "Faith isn't about certainty," he wrote. "It's about trust. Trust in something bigger than yourself, even when you can't see it or understand it." He paused, tapping the pen against the desk. The memories came flooding back. Childhood Sundays spent in church, moments of doubt and fear, and the unexpected comfort he found in prayer during his lowest points. For the first time in years, Trump felt a sense of clarity. Lily's question had done more than silence a room. It had awakened something within him, a desire to reconnect with the part of himself that often lay buried beneath the weight of his public persona. Later that day, as the rain cleared and the sun peeked through the clouds, Trump decided to take a walk. Without his usual entourage, he strolled through the quiet streets of Shreveport, his hands tucked into his coat pockets. He passed by small shops and cafes, nodding politely to those who recognized him. Some approached hesitantly, offering kind words about the town hall. One elderly man stopped him near a park bench, his voice filled with emotion. "I was there last night," the man said, his hands trembling slightly. "And I just wanted to thank you. What you said, it made me think about my own faith, about things I haven't thought about in years." Trump shook the man's hand, humbled by the sincerity in his words. "It wasn't just me," he replied. "That little girl, Lily, she reminded us all of what really matters." The man nodded, his eyes misty. "She did. She reminded me that it's never too late to start asking questions again." As Trump continued his walk, he found himself reflecting on the ripple effect of Lily's question. It wasn't just a moment in a town hall. It was a spark that had ignited something far larger. Across town, Lily and her mother were at the local library. Lily had insisted on coming, her curiosity driving her to explore the answers to questions she hadn't even asked yet. She wandered through the rows of books, her fingers grazing the spines as she searched for something that resonated. Finally, she found a small section on theology and faith. Pulling a book from the shelf, she settled into a nearby chair and began to read. The words were dense, but she didn't mind. She was determined to understand, to keep seeking the answers that had eluded her. As the day turned to evening, the threads of the night before continued to weave through the community. Conversations sparked by Lily's question popped up in homes, cafes, and even in church groups. People shared their own experiences with faith, their struggles, and their hopes. For Trump, the experience was transformative. That night, back in his hotel room, he picked up the phone and called one of his oldest friends, a man who had been a spiritual mentor during a particularly difficult time in his life. "I've been thinking a lot about faith," Trump admitted, his voice quieter than usual, "about what it means and how I've let it take a backseat for too long." His friend listened patiently before responding. "Faith is a journey, Donald. It's not about where you've been. It's about where you're willing to go from here." As Trump hung up the phone, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. He didn't have all the answers, far from it. But for the first time in a long while, he felt ready to seek them. And somewhere in Shreveport, an 8-year-old girl named Lily went to bed with her grandmother's Bible resting on her bedside table, its pages illuminated by the soft glow of a nightlight. She didn't know the full impact of her question yet, but she sensed that it had set something in motion, something that was only just beginning. Echoes of the question. The days following the town hall took on a life of their own, the reverberations of Lily's question spreading far beyond the modest fellowship hall in Shreveport. News outlets picked up snippets of the event, framing it as a rare and poignant moment of humanity in an often divisive political landscape. A photo of Lily clutching her grandmother's Bible as she asked her question went viral, accompanied by headlines like "The Question That Stopped a Room" and "A Child's Faith Challenges a Nation." At school, Lily quickly became the center of attention. Classmates who rarely noticed her suddenly wanted to sit with her at lunch or share their own questions about God and faith. Teachers stopped her in the hallways, offering quiet words of encouragement. Even the school principal called her into the office, not for punishment, but to commend her bravery. "You reminded all of us that even the smallest voice can make the biggest impact," Principal Holloway said, her eyes warm behind her glasses. Lily nodded politely, though she felt a bit overwhelmed. It wasn't that she disliked the attention, but it felt strange to be treated differently for simply asking what had been in her heart all along. Meanwhile, the story caught the attention of national audiences. Major news anchors discussed it during primetime segments, emphasizing the contrast between Trump's typical bombastic style and his unexpectedly heartfelt response. The viral moment became a talking point in sermons, podcasts, and online forums, sparking conversations about faith, vulnerability, and the power of a single question. For Donald Trump, the experience lingered in his mind like an unshakable melody. Back in New York, he sat in his office, the city skyline stretching beyond the window, but his thoughts were far from the usual business deals and media headlines. The leather-bound Bible he had mentioned during the town hall rested on his desk, open to the passage in Proverbs he had quoted. He stared at the words, their simplicity masking a profound depth. "Trust in the Lord with all your heart," he murmured to himself, his fingers lightly tracing the text. His assistant entered, holding a stack of papers. "Mr. Trump, these are the proposals for next week's meeting," she said, setting them down. Trump looked up, nodding absently. "Thank you, Sarah," he replied, but his gaze quickly returned to the Bible. She hesitated before leaving, noticing his uncharacteristic demeanor. "Sir, if I may, that was quite a moment in Shreveport. My parents watched it on the news, and they haven't stopped talking about it." He leaned back in his chair, a rare smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "It's funny," he said. "I've been asked thousands of questions in my life, but that one stays with you." Sarah nodded, her own eyes softening. Sometimes, the simplest questions are the hardest to answer. As she left, Trump leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. He thought about how to carry forward the sincerity of that moment, how to move beyond sound bites and delve into something deeper. Back in Shreveport, Lily's mother decided to take her to the local church where her grandmother had once been an active member. It had been years since they attended regularly, but something about the events of the past few days made it feel like the right time. The small chapel was quiet when they arrived, the late afternoon sun streaming through the stained glass windows in hues of amber and rose. Lily ran her fingers along the pews, the wood cool and smooth beneath her touch. "Grandma used to sit right here," her mother said, pointing to a spot near the front. Lily sat down, the Bible still tucked under her arm. "Do you think Grandma would be proud of me?" she asked, her voice small. Her mother placed a hand on her shoulder. "I know she would be. She always said faith wasn't just about knowing all the answers. It was about being brave enough to ask the questions." Lily nodded, comforted by the thought. She opened the Bible, flipping through its worn pages until she found a passage she'd underlined with her grandmother years ago, Matthew 18:3. "Truly I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven," Lily read aloud. Her mother smiled, her eyes misty. "That's the kind of faith your grandmother had. Simple, honest, and full of wonder." In the weeks that followed, letters began pouring in from across the country. Some were addressed to Trump, others to Lily, sent care of her local church. Many of the letters shared personal stories of faith, doubt, and the transformative power of asking questions. One letter, written in elegant cursive on lavender stationery, stood out to Lily. "Dear Lily," it began, "I watched you on the news and was moved to tears. You reminded me of the questions I used to ask as a child, questions I stopped asking as I grew older and life became more complicated. Thank you for bringing me back to that place of wonder and hope. Never stop asking, and never stop believing that your voice matters. With love and gratitude, Ruth Simmons." Lily showed the letter to her mother, who smiled and tucked it into a scrapbook they had started to document the experience. Trump, too, received an outpouring of letters and messages. Some thanked him for his candidness. Others challenged him to continue exploring his faith more openly. He read as many as he could, moved by the vulnerability people shared. One letter, in particular, caught his attention. It was from a pastor in Tennessee who had been following the story. "Mr. Trump," the letter read, "your response to that little girl's question reminded me of something important. Faith isn't just a private journey. It's something that can inspire and connect us all. I encourage you to keep reflecting on what God means to you and to share that journey with others. You never know who might need to hear it." Trump set the letter down, his thoughts swirling. He realized that Lily's question wasn't just about him or even the people in that room. It was about a shared longing for something greater, something that united people across differences and divides. As the sun set over Shreveport one evening, Lily sat on her front porch, her legs swinging over the edge of the wooden steps. She watched the sky shift from gold to deep indigo, the first stars beginning to appear. Her mother joined her, carrying 2 mugs of cocoa. "What are you thinking about, sweetheart?" Lily sipped her cocoa, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "I'm thinking about what Mr. Trump said, that faith is a journey. Do you think I'm on a journey, Mom?" Her mother smiled, wrapping an arm around her. "I think we all are, Lily. And you've already taken some very big steps." Lily nodded, her heart swelling with a quiet sense of purpose. The question she'd asked in that crowded hall had been the beginning, but she knew it wouldn't be the end. There were more questions to ask, more truths to seek, and more hearts to touch. And as the stars twinkled above, She felt certain of one thing: the journey was only just beginning. The tapestry unfolds. As the story of Lily's question continued to ripple across the nation, it found its way into places and conversations no one could have anticipated. From bustling urban centers to quiet rural towns, people from all walks of life were drawn to the simplicity of her words and the sincerity of her intent. What began as a heartfelt moment in a small Louisiana fellowship hall had grown into a movement of reflection, touching hearts in ways that politics or rhetoric rarely could. For Lily, life carried on much the same, though with an added layer of introspection. At school, her teacher, Mrs. Jenkins, invited her to share her experience during a class discussion about courage and self-expression. "Lily," Mrs. Jenkins said, standing at the front of the classroom, "what made you ask such a big question in front of so many people?" Lily hesitated, her cheeks flushing pink as her classmates turned to look at her. She took a deep breath, clutching her notebook tightly. "I guess I just really wanted to know," she said simply. "Sometimes, when you're wondering about something so much, you just have to ask." The class was quiet for a moment before a boy in the back raised his hand. "Did you get your answer?" he asked. Lily thought about it, a small smile playing on her lips. "Not all of it," she admitted, "but I think that's okay. It's like, maybe the answer isn't just one thing. Maybe it's a lot of little things, and you have to look for them everywhere." The room buzzed with quiet murmurs as her classmates processed her words. Mrs. Jenkins beamed, proud of the thoughtful dialogue her young student had inspired. Meanwhile, Donald Trump found himself navigating a whirlwind of events, his schedule packed with meetings, speeches, and media appearances. Yet through it all, the memory of Lily's question lingered, casting a quiet shadow over his typically hectic days. One morning, as he prepared for a televised interview, his assistant handed him a manila envelope. "These just came in, sir," she said, her tone unusually gentle. Trump opened the envelope to find a stack of letters, more messages from people moved by his response to Lily. One, written on plain-lined paper in shaky handwriting, stood out. "Mr. Trump," it began, "I'm an 84-year-old widow living in a small town in Idaho. For years, I've struggled with my faith after losing my husband and daughter in a car accident. But when I heard you talk about trusting in God, even when you don't have all the answers, something changed in me. It felt like a small light turning on in a very dark room. Thank you for reminding me that it's never too late to find hope again. With gratitude, Marjorie." Trump read the letter twice, his usual stoic demeanor giving way to a softness that surprised even him. He folded the letter carefully, slipping it into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. During the interview, when asked about his reflections on the town hall, he spoke with uncharacteristic vulnerability. "That little girl, Lily," he said, "asked me a question I think we all should be asking ourselves. What does God mean to us? It's not an easy question, and it doesn't have a quick answer. But it's the kind of question that makes you stop and think, really think, about what matters most." His words struck a chord with viewers, sparking a surge of interest in the larger conversation about faith and purpose. Religious leaders, commentators, and everyday individuals began sharing their own answers to Lily's question, creating a tapestry of perspectives that reflected the diversity of human experience. Back in Shreveport, Lily's mother was stunned when the local pastor called to tell her that a major news network wanted to interview Lily. They said they want to hear her story from her own perspective. Pastor Jim explained, "It's a wonderful opportunity, but only if you and Lily are comfortable with it." Lily's mother sat her daughter down to discuss the request. "You don't have to do this if you don't want to," she said gently. "But if you feel like sharing your story could help others, it might be worth considering." Lily looked thoughtful, her small hands folded neatly in her lap. "Do you think it would make Grandma proud?" she asked softly. Her mother smiled, brushing a strand of hair from Lily's face. "I think she'd be proud of you, no matter what you choose." After a long pause, Lily nodded. "Okay, I'll do it." The interview was scheduled for the following week, and the days leading up to it were filled with nervous excitement. On the day of the interview, Lily wore her best Sunday dress, the same one she'd worn to the town hall, and clutched her grandmother's Bible tightly. The set was bustling with cameras, lights, and people moving about. But the interviewer, a kind woman named Anne, quickly put Lily at ease. "Lily," Anne began, her tone warm and inviting, "you've become quite an inspiration to so many people. Can you tell us what made you ask that question?"